This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to analyst and researcher Rasha Al Aqeedi. Rasha is from Mosul and she's going to be talking about how ISIS took over Mosul, how they held it for so long, and how that now, even after the Iraqi army has defeated ISIS as a territorial force there, how ISIS is still operating in Mosul as a kind of underground criminal network. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting on the Patreon. There's bonus episodes and all sorts of extras. Go to patreon.com/popularfront, or if you prefer, go to popularfront.co/support. There are other options there. So firstly, maybe you can explain, why is it Mosul fell so quickly to ISIS when it did? Like, maybe you can go into the history of that for us.
Well, there are two well-known reasons as to why Mosul fell so quickly. The first being the Iraqi military abandoning their posts instead of defending the city against a convoy of 400 to 800 ISIS militants. The reasons until this day are quite unclear as to why this happened. Did they receive orders? Was there simply no will to fight? It's still unclear till this day. But the second reason, which is not so much discussed and not really studied, and it's how well established the ISIS underground networks had been for several years at that point. And to understand how these networks were established to begin with, we have to go back to 2003 and the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. So Saddam's army also abandoned their post. They also abandoned the city, and they left behind a massive arsenal of weapons that were unmonitored and unchecked, and no one really knows where they went at the time. And it took about a week until the U.S. Army actually reached the city, and by the time they reached, the weapons were gone. Another reason why ISIS networks found it so easy to establish that doesn't really go into account when talking about this was the introduction of new modern communication that Iraqis had been deprived for because of the economic sanctions. So we didn't have cell phones and we didn't have internet. And of course, when they first arrived in the country, people were consuming them also unmonitored and unchecked. So anyone can go and buy 10 to 20 new cell phone numbers without even an ID. And the reason why this is important is because these anonymous cell phones were probably the first way that they began contacting civilians to extract money and issue death threats. And I'll talk about that later in detail. But going back to these networks, it's important to focus on the fact that it wasn't just ISIS at the time, meaning ISIS was not, of course, did not exist at that time. That it wasn't just the jihadist network. Now, there was a marginal jihadist network in the immediate fall of Saddam's regime in 2003 that had began gathering in the country, actually even prior to his fall, by late 2002. But there were also people that simply rejected the new political process in Iraq. They were against the new Iraq to begin with. Some of them did not like the invasion. They did not like the sight of U.S. tanks in the city. And others simply rejected completely the political shift that took the power from the Sunni minority to the Shia majority. There was also that. And they wanted to focus this sort of resistance or insurgency against the U.S. Forces at the time. But the jihadist networks were there. But at this time, they were kind of all operating with the same modus operandi. They purchased these a massive number of cell phones, and they really exploited the introduction of the internet to facilitate communication with each other, making it very easy and unchecked for. Again, the city at the time, most of the time, still there was no presence of like a visible security force. Even there were U.S. troops in the streets. Things were relatively calm to begin with, but it was definitely the calm that was before the storm. The first visible or tangible impact that these networks had began pretty much after the death of Uday and Qusay, who were both killed by the U.S. forces in Mosul. This is when these networks began issuing death threats using these cell phones. So what they would do is they would call certain individuals to extort money under the pretext of jihad. They would contact wealthy people demanding money for this jihad, and they would threaten them with either harming them directly or killing a member of their family if they did not actually deliver the money. And this is when we can start to see the distinction between the jihadist networks and the other insurgency groups. So the other insurgency groups, they weren't harming Iraqis. Their attacks were focused on the U.S. Troops. But when death threats were issued against Iraqis, and they were actually killed at the time, and this is also when we see that the jihadist groups began to absorb all the other groups as well. So by the beginning of 2006, we had the establishment of Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen in Iraq that united pretty much all the jihadist groups. As for the other insurgents, some of them quit. They no longer wanted to be part of it because Iraqis were being killed. Others actually joined because it was the only way to fight the new Iraq and the new political order. And we see in 2006 things really heating up in Mosul. Assassinations were carried out pretty much daily. Almost everyone had at some point received a death threat. The university at the time, it was very common to see different decrees and sometimes even videotapes or CDs of people being beheaded or executed. They had a very, very strong presence, and that's when they were emboldened enough to actually carry out their first attempt at taking over the city.
Wait, this was 2006, you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
So ISIS back then, what was it, ISI then? They tried to rise up in 2006.
Yeah, so it was the Islamic State of Iraq at the time that was established later on in the year. And it wasn't a caliphate at the time, and it wasn't Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, it was Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and he wasn't the caliph, he was Amir al-Mu'mineen, so he was Amir of that organization. They took over the city for about a week. Now, how they did that was a very sophisticated campaign where we saw the first massive use of VBIEDs in the city. They placed the VBIED and I think a few suicide attacks as well at almost every police station in the east side. And they went off simultaneously. So within 4 hours, there were over 12 explosions. And again, the security forces kind of fled the area. They took over. They raised different flags, and they were masked militants. And that lasted for, it was exactly less than a week. And the Iraqi forces took the city back. I think it was kind of a strategic decision from their side to kind of retreat. They hadn't really thought out what the next phase was, but it was heavily used in their propaganda. It was a way for them to establish their presence, and that the Islamic State of Iraq was here, and that's when their here to stay kind of began. They melted quickly into the city afterwards because, again, they were masked militants, so it was hard for the security forces to identify them. It was kind of a trial and error experience for them, but at the same time, the way the Iraqi forces dealt with it in the next phase was very problematic, and it was very beneficial for them. Because they were unknown, the Iraqi security forces ended up randomly arresting people in a very arbitrary way that really didn't distinguish between civilians and didn't really take into account that arresting hundreds of young people at the same time isn't even exactly how the networks would operate. They would just pretty much arrest everyone they would see. Yeah,
it's just going to piss off everybody then.
Yeah, exactly. And it really did.
Right. So then how did that affect when ISIS finally did take Mosul?
Oh, like I was saying, it was like a trial and error thing for them. They were just experimenting.
Like a dry run.
Exactly, yes, like a dry run. So the next time around, they would be better prepared. They had a plan in sight. At the time, again, like I was saying, when they took over the city for a week, there was no end game to it. They just kind of wanted to show people that they were around. Now they realize, hey, we can actually do this. We just need to weaken the city even further. The military has its issues. We can infiltrate the public sector quite easily because we've been extorting people for almost a year now, and no one has really done anything about it. Let's just establish our networks better this time, and we have an end plan, and that is to establish an actual caliphate. Now, this idea wasn't very popular in Mosul at the time. I think in Iraq in general, there were people warning that this was what they wanted to do, but no one really took it seriously. Just the concept of a caliphate was very alien. It was quite foreign, and no one took into account that this might actually happen. Over the next few years, it was extremely rough, meaning that the number of suicide attacks and VBIED attacks and assassinations, they just skyrocketed, with very little actually happening regarding the security forces, basically, they just did not know how to deal with them. They were not prepared to fight this kind of an insurgency. They were dealing, at this time, they were operating basically like a mafia, like a gang. Yes, their assassinations were targeted public employees. The very few Shiites, for example, in the city of Mosul, many of them were assassinated and killed. The Christians and Yazidis as well, they faced attacks. It was, yes, their targets were very specifically chosen, but the way they were operating, the means that they were operating, it was something that the Interior Ministry just did not know how to deal with at the time.
So they were like an underground cell at the time, but they still had power, right? They were starting to get a grip.
Yes, at this phase, their grip was very much strengthened, and they began to infiltrate the public sector, the public offices in the city, and it was very easy. All they had to do was just issue death threats. At this point, some of the officials, like Ninawa's governor at the time, Athena Jafi, and this is not to exonerate him. I personally think he failed as a politician on all levels. But he was faced with a very, very tough choice. He was like, okay, my public employees, my engineers, my staff, they're being assassinated. And the security forces are not doing anything to protect them. I need to step in to do something to protect these people. And he thought that if he kind of, not cut a deal with them, but if he kind of gave in to their demands, which were mostly at the time strictly financial, that this would help save his own staff, his relatives, his family, and also the people that were working at the government at the time, at all the public offices. And their demands also began to increase. So with every project entering Nineveh, the entire province, they began demanding a rate of 10 to 15%, a tax rate, basically. And this is how they amassed all that wealth. It wasn't really foreign funding, which, if you recall, in the beginning of the ISIS phenomenon, that's what everyone was talking about. Which countries, which foreign states are funding this? This is not an Iraqi organization. Actually, it was very much an Iraqi organization. It was very local. The way they gained their wealth was also very local, and it became kind of normalized. Every project in the city, there was something to be paid for this insurgent to the Dawla. That's what they would call themselves, which basically means state. And also because they were so local, they understood what was happening within the military at the time. They even managed to infiltrate that sort of. I don't mean infiltrate as in join the army. I mean that they knew what was going on there. They knew, for example, there was massive corruptions within the ranks of the army. There was a phenomenon called the ghost. The ghost troops, the ghost soldiers, where they did not really exist. They were not in the city, but they were just taking salaries. So there were soldiers on paper, like their names were there, but they were not present on the ground.
Why are they not on the ground? You mean people just taking pensions or taking wages and just not turning up?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
That's a big problem, right?
Yeah, it really is.
It happens a lot in Iraq, right?
It definitely happened in the prelude kind of period, so before 2014, yes. And this was when they were confident enough to carry out that surge. They knew the number of Iraqi troops inside the city and in Nineveh in general, in the province, were not 50,000. The number was a lot less, and they had enough finances. I mean, they had been feeding off the state for over 7 years at that point, and they had gained a fortune. It was hundreds of millions of dollars from public money. And why not? They thought, okay, when we have a plan. And also, I want to emphasize a point I kind of feel that I've left out so far, talking about the ideology. The ideology was absolutely important. They were people that supported them from inside the city, who actually believed in the idea of a caliphate and wanted this sort of strict Sharia law to rule the country, or at least Nineveh or Mosul. Now, their numbers were not very huge, but these were these kind of individuals. They kind of played like an insider role. They were like feeding them information. They were giving them details. They were actually informing them who to threaten, who to extort throughout the years. And this went on for a significant amount of time. And again, their numbers were not massive, but when ISIS actually decided to enter the city, these people were aware. So the vast majority of Mosul, I would argue, did not know exactly who the Islamic State were.
They had their flags, no?
Yes, they did raise the flags in certain areas, but I'm talking in general. Like, we're talking about a city of over 2 million, so there were people, like I was saying, who did know about them. Some people celebrated. I mean, we saw the footage. They were raising the flag and they were openly celebrating the arrival of ISIS. But for the vast majority of people staying at home, they did not know exactly what was going on. Those first 10 days, since like June 8th, 2014, it was very, very confusing for the locals there. It was so confusing that there was actually a parliament member at the time, Maysoon Damlouji, who had relatives in Mosul. She went on public television saying, "These are local rebels. This is not the Islamic State. This is not Daesh." And this is a politician, a very liberal one. She would not have said that without being 100% confident that this was what she was being told was real. So even my own family, my friends, my relatives, when I would talk to them, they would tell me, "We don't know who these guys are. They look local. They're not dressed in the, perception of what an ISIS militant would wear, like the Afghan attire and the long beard. They looked like Iraqis. They were from rural areas. They had a local accent. They were calling themselves rebels." So it was very confusing. But within 1 week, when they issued their, Islamic State decree, they were denouncing the Iraqi state. They were saying Iraq as a country no longer exists. We're going to demolish the borders with Syria, and now Sharia law is ruling. State nation has not worked for Iraq, so let's try Sharia law. That's when it kind of hit everyone that, oh no, this is 100% ISIS. And the rest is history. We all know what happened during those 2 years and a half under ISIS rule, and then the military operation to retake Mosul caused the city massive damage, and the old town is still was completely, pretty much wiped out of the map, and there are still people under rubble, and ISIS today, they kind of, or the Islamic State networks, they kind of find themselves in the same position that they were in back in 2006. So while it has demolished the caliphate, and this is probably the most overstated, boring argument currently being said. It's literally been written a million times and it's very obvious. But yes, the networks are operating.
Well, let's talk about that because, all the journalists are gone now because the fighting is over, but the place is still in rubble. Corpses are still under rocks. And from what I understand, ISIS are kind of back. Maybe not back, like you said, they've been there, but they're operating in Mosul again, right? Maybe you can tell us how they're doing that.
Yes, they are operating. As we saw, recently, just last month there were two VBIEDs and 3 people were killed in total, and one of them was placed in a relatively secure area. So it does show us that they're also gaining confidence, and they're stepping up their game a bit, but they are struggling with it this time. It's not as easy.
But it's very real, as you just said, a car bomb went off. People are still dying because of ISIS.
Yes, of course, it's still a very serious threat.
Right, and so you said they're a gang now. What are they actually doing?
Okay, we have to look at the context right now in Mosul itself. So we have several different armed groups. We have the army, we have the police, we have the federal police, and the police force, and different militia groups as well. And what they're seeing, this is from their perspective, how they're beginning to operate. And I'll talk about that later, but how they're beginning to operate now, they're looking at the context. It reminds them a lot of the pre-2006 period. Corruption within the local government and also within the military and security forces. And a detail I left out that I should have mentioned earlier. So when the Islamic State of Iraq and these insurgent networks were issuing death threats and extorting people, civilians would actually go and go to the security forces at the time. They would go to the army and they would complain, "This is happening to us." Now, there were some soldiers that actually would then actually demand that the civilians pay them too. They'd be like, "Okay, if you're paying ISIS, why don't you pay us as well?" So with the context today in Mosul and the complexity and the massive number of forces and different groups, there are also certain militia members and army members that are also extorting the people. They're demanding money from the people of Mosul.
So just to get that straight, some of the security forces are extorting the civilians of Mosul, even now after all of that they've just gone through?
And not to generalize, of course, this is not every single person or every member of the military or even the militias that are doing this, but there are a number of them, and it started very early on. And this is when kind of ISIS also manages to kind of say, okay, this looks familiar, because now there's discontent and there's anger, and we exploited this the first time. We might be able to do this again, it's not even a secret. Like, specifically the militias, they're demanding a massive amount of money from local businesses. Also, it's kind of like protection rackets in a way, but they do have their salaries, and the Ministry of Interior doesn't really seem to be doing anything about it. Even just addressing this topic in public, whether it's on traditional media or social media, it's kind of something that people are in denial about.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to see, obviously we're not going to see the return of ISIS in Mosul as it was, but it sounds like these things are not going to get any better.
Well, corruption is still very widespread, whether it's among the security forces and how some of the militants are dealing with the people, or how the local government is also sort of just managing things. Yes, there are a lot of issues. The city is very much in rubble still, and services are bad. There's lack of employment. Actually, employment does not even exist. There hasn't been any attempts to sort of rehabilitate what has been damaged. And ISIS at this point, the networks, they're sort of lurking. It's been hard for them also to reorganize and to regather. But the longer these issues stay without any solution, of course they're going to exploit it like they did the first time. Now, corruption is so widespread, and it's kind of all tangled. And just recently, the ferry tragedy that killed so many women and children is just one example.
And just for anyone that doesn't know, maybe you can quickly explain that situation with the ferry recently.
So what happened was there was a ferry that would just kind of transport people from one side of the river to the other, and it basically just sunk because it was it was overloaded. That was the reason, and also because of such high currents during this season. Now, the owner of the ferry actually has recently been arrested, and he said that the reason he had to overload and allow so many people on board was because a certain militia in Mosul had demanded $3 million from him, and there was no way he was going to make that money by just operating as he should have been operating. So this is a problem it's actually a two-sided problem. On one hand, it shows you that if it's proven to be true that the militias actually did extort him and he had to do this, it just shows you the level of corruption and how no one is really doing anything to tackle it. And the other issue is that there are obviously no regulations, no oversight. Like, there were no life jackets on the ferry. No one actually enforced the fact that there should be only 100 people on board instead of 200 something. And it just kind of shows you that the city is operating basically there's no law. The law is not being really enforced. No one's really following. And again, this is something that ISIS and these different networks, they can exploit when they want.
Right. And when you said the gangs are operating in Mosul still, the ISIS gangs, how are they doing that? What's going on? Like, do they have some kind of hideout, or are they just blending into the population, or do people not know who they are? Like, how are they managing to operate?
No, they're just. It's not that they're blending. Like, I believe the vast majority of them are well known. They're just kind of they are kind of hiding out. Like, they're not out very much in public. And how they're operating, again, we go back to how they were operating back in 2004 and 2005. It's pretty much the same way. They're at this phase right now where they're at the assassination phase. And the target this time around has been the local mukhtars of the neighborhood. A mukhtar is essentially like a neighborhood sheriff. This is someone who knows the original residents of the areas, like how long people have lived there. He knows the newcomers, who goes in and who goes out.
Kind of like a village elder sort of thing.
Yes, pretty much. They're actually, yes, most of them are actually quite old. So this is where the ISIS networks are at the moment. They've assassinated a significant number of these mukhtars, and the reason from my perspective is that they want to to make the newcomers in these neighborhoods like their own members, or people affiliated with them. So when they move into these new neighborhoods, there's no one who can kind of record their movements. Like if the Mukhtar is dead and someone moves into the area who's new, who's going to know this person is new? Who's going to know their background? The Mukhtar knew every single detail about pretty much the family history of everyone living in that area. So when a newcomer comes in and there's no Mukhtar in that area, it's like a fresh start for them. They can start pretty much from scratch. And this is quite a significant and also a very dangerous phase in where they're operating to begin with. Also, there are not many neighborhoods that have been rehabilitated, particularly in the west side of Mosul. And this is led because they were obviously very damaged during the battle to retake the city. And with this amount of destruction, it's become quite easy for individuals that are not from this area and members of these insurgent networks to infiltrate and sort of just claim a home that's like partially damaged and kind of claim it as their own, especially families are not returning. And we see this actually happening a lot in the West. And with no Mukhtar to record who this family is, what their background was, this is when when the reestablishment of these networks become quite easy for them.
There's a big difference, right, between East Mosul and West Mosul. Obviously you're from Mosul, you'll understand it better than anyone, so maybe you can explain that for us.
Okay, yeah, so the West Mosul is the authentic part of the city. This was the oldest parts of the town. The old town was there, and it was the first neighborhoods that were actually established. The east side was pretty much rehabilitated at the beginning of the last century, sometime between 1920s or 1930s. That's when the relics, the Assyrian relics, were discovered by different expeditions, and that's when life kind of pumped into the east side. It was pretty much just an abandoned land that was very green, but no one lived there. But it became the modern part of Mosul. It was where the university was set, the modern hospitals, even the designs of homes. They were more westernized. They looked more like Baghdad than and other parts of Iraq, more than the West. Had a very, very specific character to it. It was very Ottoman in a sense. And because it was so old and it was not rehabilitated, it lost its relevance when modernity kind of entered Iraq within the 40s and 50s. Yeah, it still had economic significance, and the large markets were still there, but it kind of lost out to the east side of the city.
We've spoken before, and you told me about this story where, like, ISIS was set up in your bedroom or something after you'd left. Can you tell us that story?
That's an interesting way to put it. And yeah, it's not a story though; it's like real life. So yes, after my family left the city, they left Mosul in mid 2015. They were there for a whole year under ISIS. Like my parents, they confiscated our home and they turned our home into like an education bureau because we live in relative proximity to the university, I think. And they turned my bedroom into obviously some kind of storage for files. So after Mosul was liberated and my parents went back, my mom called me and said, "We found resumes like a CV or CVs in your room that are like quite interesting." And I thought they were mine from all the jobs I had applied to previously. And she said, "No, these are not yours. This is some American guy, and he wants to join ISIS." And I said, "Okay, you need to scan that CV right now, and I need to see it."
So it was a CV to join ISIS, like, please can I join? I'm a dedicated jihadist. I can work in a team. I can cut heads off with one hand.
Actually, no, the applications that we found were to Mosul University to become lecturers or teachers.
Yeah, sure. Or a cook.
No, but this was a proper CV, like a proper, and it had a cover letter too. And it so he basically explained that he was very interested in the Islamic State, and he wanted to teach at Mosul University. And when I first saw that, first thing that crossed my mind was like, okay, this is an American, someone claiming to be American. I had no idea where he was at the time, if he was in the States or was he in Iraq, or no one knew. And he wanted to join the Islamic State. What if this person is still in the United States and is trying to join ISIS? And what if, God forbid, he carries out a terrorist attack there? I need to get this to someone. So I contacted my friends at Program on Extremism at George Washington University. I was still affiliated with them at the time. And they verified this person's email. So he had his phone number, his email, his previous workplaces. Like I was saying, it's like a proper CV. And they sent it to the FBI, and his email was verified, and turned out to be he turned out to be in Syria at the time. I think that he joined ISIS for the reasons that you probably mentioned, but he found that the battle was too harsh for him for some reason, so he wanted to turn into academia. But this was the same man that was his name is Warren Clark, and this was the same man that was recently caught by the SDF. Actually, earlier this year, the Syrian Democratic Forces did catch him.
Oh, shame. What do you think is going to happen now for the future? For Mosul, what do you think is the most likely situation?
I believe the likely situation is going to be like this sort of, when we talked about the prelude to 2014, the period between 2006 and between 2014, when ISIS, the networks were establishing and all of that, I believe we're going to see a repetition of this period here, but it's not going to lead to the return of the caliphate. I don't think we're ever going to see a caliph again in Mosul or elsewhere. But that period itself, when we see a rise in assassinations, in car bombs, in VBIEDs, in suicide attacks, perhaps in extortion, that's probably gonna drag on for a while. And I believe that if it's not tackled immediately and properly by the security forces, that's a whole different podcast in itself, then it's going to very much exhaust the province. And we noticed that unless ISIS is in control and there's an actual caliph, ascending some mosque in Mosul in all black attire, looking like he's from the 7th century, it doesn't really grab attention. Someone in Europe or the United States hears that there's violence in Mosul, a car bomb went off in the city, people are being extorted or kidnapped. The first thing that they're going to think of is, okay, but there's been violence in Iraq for 16 years. How is this different? And this time around also, there's not so much attention from the rest of the country. As long as these networks or ISIS itself is not advancing towards Baghdad or towards the south or towards the Kurdistan regional government, the Karachi area, it's kind of like, okay, whatever. This has happened before. It's not a big deal. We can contain them in this area. Whereas Nineveh is a massive province. It has nearly 3 million people, over 1 million refugees in different camps across the area. You have also relatives and people affiliated with ISIS, entire refugee camps of these women and children that we don't even know what to do with. No one is even talking about this. And it might kind of seem like small problems to Baghdad, but this is not a problem that we want to deal with in the future. This can accumulate and result in a storm that no one wants. Maybe not in a caliph or caliphate or ISIS again as we saw them a couple years back, but having a massive province out of control is not something anyone wants in their country.
Okay, brilliant. Hopefully things get better. Thank you very much, Rasha. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap this up?
I would like to just point at the countering violent extremism, the CVE programs that usually talk about the rhetoric and the discourses used and how to counter thoughts, and that's all very important. But when we're talking about the Islamic State, when it's in its habitual state, that's what I would call them, because I genuinely believe that the caliphate and its establishment, that was like out of the norm. That was the exception. The norm is when they operate in these sort of underground networks. That's been going on for over a decade now, and this will continue. We need to look at that. They're not operating in a very significant way. They're operating the same way any mafia or any gang does, and we see replicants of this and similar modus operandi in South America, and we see it in Africa as well in different places. And they should be also tackled within this, they should be tackled as a gang, I guess I'm trying to say, not as the Islamic State of Iraq. So we don't need to necessarily look so deeply into what is their religious rhetoric at this point. It doesn't really matter. You don't need a fatwa to kidnap someone or to take ransom. That happens in different places. And Iraq needs to definitely strengthen its interior forces. They need to be less politicized and less polarized. Sectarianism and politics in general should not ever have to play a role in this. I believe this is the only thing that can really take us, kind of to the next level where the Islamic State is kind of a thing of the past and no longer a real threat.
Okay. And where can people get hold of you and contact you, follow your work?
So I'm currently a Robert A. Fox Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, and my work. You can follow my work there at fpri.com. I also manage Raise Your Voice, or as it's pronounced in Arabic, Irfa Sotak. It's an Arabic-based website. The content's all in Arabic, but we focus on communities in Iraq and in Syria, specifically communities that have been traumatized by war and how they're just coping with their current circumstances. We address their issues, and we also shed a light on a lot of the humanitarian stories and triumphs that are coming in from these areas. I'm on Twitter a lot, obviously. You can follow me there at Rasha Al Aqeedi. That's RASHAALAQEEDI. And thanks so much for having me on Popular Front.
So that was Rasha Al Aqeedi speaking about ISIS, how they rose up in Mosul, how they took over, and how they're still there despite the operation to get rid of them. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting on the Patreon. There's bonus episodes, all sorts of extras regularly on there. That is patreon.com/popularfront. Or if you don't like Patreon, which is understandable, go to popularfront.co/support. There are many different ways you can support us there. Even just sharing this and telling your mates is really useful. The new Popular Front documentary is out now. It's called Ukraine's Anarchist Underground. We follow a group of anarchists violently fighting back against the neo-fascist militias and also the government to some degree. Go to popularfront.co/underground to watch that, or go to the youtube.com/popularfront. You'll be able to find it. It's on top of the page. Please do share it. Let us know what you think, because unfortunately the scum at YouTube have age restricted the documentary. Now the reason for this, they say, is that there's violence shown in the documentary. Sky News, BBC News and Vice News all have very gory dispatches up on their YouTube pages, but surprise, they haven't been age restricted. Now, because Popular Front is not a big corporate beast of a company with coke heads running it, we have been age restricted. That is the disgusting platform that is YouTube. Basically, if you've got money and you can grease their fucking palm, then you can kind of get to the front of the queue and jump all the restrictions. So censorship is bullshit. But yeah, we do have to kind of be on YouTube because it is the biggest platform, and the other platforms, are kind of overrun with fascists and conspiracy lunatics. So unfortunately for now, we have to stay on the YouTube. But yeah, my point is, please do share it, because we are being censored to some degree. I mean, you could argue that age restriction isn't a censorship issue, but I personally think that it is. And there's absolutely no need for it when these other companies are not getting age restricted for much worse in their videos, Anyway, if you want to follow Popular Front, follow me on Twitter. That's Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN, or follow us on the Popular Front Twitter. That's Popular Front CO, or follow us on Instagram, instagram.com/popular.front. Thank you very much to the following people on the Patreon. Without you, none of this would be possible. We're doing everything on a shoestring, but we do need a little bit of money to get moving places. So thank you very much to Darby, Adam Berg-Snyder, Margaret Bowling, Axel Iverson, Brian McLaughlin, Chad Walker, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Diana Gorvanek, Elizabeth Benicki, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Jack Mayhoff, funny guy, James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker, Joel Tambusi, Kyle N. Payne, Lawrence Abrahams, LH, Michael Euler, Ari, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Q-Ball, our very own Rasha Al Aqeedi, Ryan Sandercock, Scartoon, Scott Jonesy, Sebastian from the Discord, Sarushe Hawazi, Teddy, Tom Lochrin, Tony Bin, Vida Provost and Zachary Hinch. Thank you very much. Like I said, without your help, this wouldn't really go anywhere. Popular Front, we're trying to do another documentary soon, so if you want to help support us, as Anthony Kabarik did, friend of Popular Front, helped us get off to Ukraine, please do consider supporting. As I said, popularfront.co/support. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Son of Old. His SoundCloud is soundcloud.com/son-of-old. And all of the, he makes all the music for Popular Front, and the music that is available, i.e. it's not exclusive to stuff we're going to be doing in the future, is available to listen to on his SoundCloud. So please stop asking me, what's that song? What's this song? Go to soundcloud.com/son-of-old. If we've put it up available, then it's there for you. If not, it's not.